March 3, 1943. Bismarck Sea, Pacific Theater. Japanese destroyer Captain Yamamoto thought he was safe. American bombers had been missing his ships for months. Their high-altitude attacks were like throwing rocks at a moving target. But at 7:42 a.m., something different appeared on the horizon. Not the usual formations flying high overhead, but B-25 Mitchell bombers screaming in just 50 feet above the waves, their noses bristling with not one, not two, but 8 synchronized .50 caliber machine guns. In the next 60 seconds, this single innovation would sink more Japanese warships than the previous 6 months of conventional bombing combined. The Americans had turned medium bombers into floating ship killers, and the Japanese Navy was about to learn why you never underestimate American ingenuity in wartime. But here's what nobody talks about. How did a mechanic from the Philippines convince the U.S. Army Air Forces to completely abandon everything they knew about aerial combat? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The hot Australian sun beat down on the airfield at Brisbane in the summer of 1942. Sweat dripped from the faces of American airmen as they walked between the rows of B-25 Mitchell bombers. These twin-engine planes were supposed to be the answer to America's problems in the Pacific. But right now, they looked more like expensive failures sitting on the tarmac. Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn wiped the grease from his hands with an old rag. At 42 years old, he was too old to be crawling around inside airplane engines, but somebody had to keep these birds flying. His weathered face showed the strain of months trying to make these bombers work against Japanese ships. The problem was simple to understand, but hard to fix. American bombers were missing their targets. The war in the Pacific was going badly for America in 1942. Japan controlled a massive empire that stretched from the Philippines all the way to the Solomon Islands. Japanese ships moved freely across thousands of miles of ocean, bringing supplies and troops to their island bases. Every convoy that got through made Japan stronger and America's job harder. The U.S. Navy was fighting for its life. Pearl Harbor had sunk or damaged most of the Pacific Fleet's battleships. The remaining ships were spread thin across an ocean bigger than the entire United States. American submarines were trying to stop Japanese convoys, but their torpedoes had serious problems. Many of them failed to explode when they hit enemy ships. It was like fighting with broken weapons. That left the job to the Army Air Forces, but their bombing runs were a disaster. B-25 bombers would fly high over Japanese ships and drop their bombs from 15,000 feet. The bombs would fall through the air for almost a full minute before hitting the water. By then, the ships had plenty of time to turn and dodge. Out of every 100 bombs dropped, maybe 2 would hit their target. The other 98 created harmless splashes in the ocean. General George Kenney arrived in Australia that summer to take command of Allied air forces. He was a short, stocky man with sharp eyes who had spent his whole career thinking about how to use aeroplanes in war. What he saw in Australia shocked him. American pilots were brave and skilled, but they were using the wrong tactics against Japanese ships. Kenney called a meeting of his top officers in a sweltering hangar at the Brisbane airfield. Maps of the Pacific covered the walls, showing Japanese-controlled islands marked in red. The red area seemed to cover almost everything. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Kenney said, pointing at the maps. "Japanese convoys are moving supplies faster than we can sink their ships. Our high-altitude bombing is not working. We need a new way to fight." Captain Bill Benn, one of the best B-25 pilots in the Pacific, spoke up. "Sir, what if we came in low, really low, just above the waves?" Other officers shook their heads. "That's suicide," one said. Japanese ships have dozens of anti-aircraft guns. They'll shoot down every plane that tries it. But Pappy Gun was thinking. He had been a mechanic in the Philippines before the war. When the Japanese invaded, he had escaped to Australia, leaving his wife and children behind. That made this war personal for him. He knew these B-25s better than anyone. He also knew that desperate times called for crazy ideas. "What if we gave them more guns?" Gun said quietly. "If we're going in low, we need to hit them harder than they can hit us." The hangar fell silent. Standard B-25s had only a few machine guns, mostly for defense against enemy fighters. They were bombers, not fighters. But Gun was talking about something different, something that had never been tried before. Kenny studied the weathered mechanic. He had heard stories about Gun's creative solutions to mechanical problems. "What do you have in mind, Major?" Gun walked over to a B-25 parked nearby. He ran his hand along the plane's nose, where the bombardier normally sat with his bomb sight. "This whole section here is for dropping bombs from high altitude. But what if we took all that out and put in a big gun instead? Something that could punch holes in a ship's hull." The idea was radical. No one had ever put a large cannon in the nose of a medium bomber. But these were desperate times. Japanese convoys were winning the shipping war, and America was running out of options. Within weeks, Gun and his team had installed a 75mm cannon in the nose of a B-25. The gun was enormous, sticking out from the front of the plane like the horn of some mechanical beast. They called it the B-25G, and it was unlike anything that had ever flown. The first test flights were promising, but not perfect. The big cannon could punch holes in ships, but it only fired one shot at a time. Loading the next shell took precious seconds. Japanese gunners would have plenty of time to shoot back. Gun kept thinking, if one big gun was good, maybe lots of smaller guns would be better. He started experimenting with 50 caliber machine guns, the same weapons used on fighters. These guns could fire 850 rounds per minute. A pilot could hold down the trigger and send a stream of bullets into an enemy ship. The first nose modification had 4 50 caliber guns mounted side by side. When all 4 fired together, they created a concentrated stream of bullets that could shred anything in front of the plane. But Gun was not satisfied. If 4 guns were good, more guns would be better. By late 1942, Gun's team had created something that looked like a flying battleship. The new B-25 had 6 .50 caliber machine guns crammed into its nose. When the pilot pressed the trigger, all 6 guns fired at once, sending 5,100 bullets per minute toward the target. The sound was deafening, even inside the cockpit. But Gun still was not done. He looked at the modified nose and saw room for 2 more guns. His mechanics worked through the hot Australian nights, installing the 7th and 8th machine guns. The final result was a monster that no one had ever imagined. The 8-gun nose turned the B-25 from a bomber into something entirely new. It was still officially called a medium bomber, but it looked more like a flying fortress designed for one purpose: killing ships. Each gun was perfectly aimed to converge at a point 300 yards in front of the plane. When all 8 fired together, they created what pilots called a wall of lead. News of the modified bombers spread quickly among the air crews. Some pilots were excited about the new firepower. Others worried about flying so low over heavily armed enemy ships. Everyone knew that this new tactic would be tested soon. Japanese naval commanders had no idea what was coming. Their intelligence reports mentioned American bombers, but nothing suggested any major changes in American tactics. Japanese ships continued to operate as if high-altitude bombing was still their main threat. They positioned their anti-aircraft guns to defend against attacks from above, not from just above the waves. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change naval warfare forever. American ingenuity was about to meet Japanese naval tradition in the skies over the Bismarck Sea. The modified B-25s sat on Australian airfields like loaded weapons, waiting for their chance to prove that American mechanics and pilots could solve any problem the war threw at them. Nobody knew it yet, but the age of the ship killer was about to begin. The first test came on a gray morning in January 1943. Captain Bill Benn pushed the throttles forward on his modified B-25 and felt the twin engines roar to life. Behind him, 5 more bombers with the new 8-gun noses followed his lead. They were heading toward a Japanese convoy spotted near New Guinea. This would be the real test of Pappy Gunn's crazy idea. Ben dropped his bomber to just 50 feet above the ocean waves. At this height, he could see individual sailors on the Japanese ships scrambling to their battle stations. The enemy had spotted the incoming Americans, but they were confused. These bombers were flying much lower than usual. Japanese gunners swung their weapons downward, trying to track targets that seemed to skim the water like giant metal birds. The lead Japanese destroyer opened fire first. Orange flashes erupted from its deck guns, sending shells screaming past the American bombers. One shell exploded so closely to Ben's plane that shrapnel rattled against the fuselage like hail on a tin roof. But the B-25 kept coming, its 8 machine guns pointing straight at the enemy ship. At 300 yards, Ben pressed the firing button. All 8 guns erupted at once, sending a stream of bullets toward the destroyer. The sound inside the cockpit was like being trapped inside a thunderstorm. Empty shell cases poured from the guns, bouncing around the nose section in a metallic rain. The effect on the Japanese ship was immediate and devastating. The concentrated fire from 8 machine guns was unlike anything the enemy had faced before. Bullets ripped through the destroyer's bridge, killing officers and destroying equipment. The ship's thin armor, designed to stop shell fragments, offered no protection against the heavy machine gun fire. But the first attack was not perfect. Some of the American bombers missed their targets completely. Others scored hits but did not sink their targets. One B-25 took heavy damage from Japanese return fire and barely made it back to base. The new tactic worked, but it needed improvement. Back at the Brisbane airfield, Pappy Gunn studied the battle reports with intense focus. His modified bombers had performed better than traditional high-altitude attacks, but they were still not deadly enough. Japanese ships were tougher than he had expected. He needed to find a way to make each attack count. The answer came from an unexpected source. An Australian pilot mentioned a technique called skip bombing that he had heard about from British pilots in Europe. Instead of dropping bombs from high altitude, pilots could release them at low level and skip them across the water like stones. If timed correctly, the bombs would bounce once and slam into the side of a ship just below the waterline. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Gunn realized that his modified B-25s could use both tactics at once. The 8 machine guns would suppress enemy fire and kill exposed crew members. Meanwhile, the bombs would punch holes in the hull below the waterline, causing the ship to sink. It was a 1-2 punch that no enemy ship could survive. The mechanics worked around the clock to perfect the new attack method. They practiced skip bombing runs against floating targets in the harbor. They adjusted the gun sights to ensure all 8 machine guns would hit the same point. They even modified the bomb bay doors to open faster, giving pilots more time to escape after dropping their deadly cargo. General Kenny watched these preparations with growing excitement. Intelligence reports showed a large Japanese convoy forming up near Rabaul, the main enemy base in the Southwest Pacific. The convoy included destroyers, cruisers, and transport ships carrying thousands of soldiers and tons of supplies. If that convoy reached New Guinea, it would make the American job much harder. This would be the perfect target for the new ship killer tactics. On February 28, 1943, reconnaissance planes spotted the Japanese convoy heading south through the Bismarck Sea. 8 destroyers surrounded 12 transport ships loaded with troops and supplies. The convoy was heavily defended, but it was also moving in predictable formation. American commanders knew exactly where to find them. The modified B-25s took off before dawn on March 2nd. 18 bombers with 8-gun noses formed up with conventional bombers and P-38 fighter escorts. It was the largest formation of ship killers ever assembled. The pilots knew they were about to test everything Pappy Gunn had taught them about fighting Japanese ships. Lieutenant George Lawson flew his B-25 in the second wave of attackers. Through his cockpit window, he could see the Japanese convoy spread across miles of ocean. Smoke from the ship's funnels created dark columns against the morning sky. Anti-aircraft fire began to fill the air around the approaching bombers, creating black puffs of smoke that marked near misses. The first wave of B-25s went in at masthead height, their 8 guns blazing. The concentrated firepower was devastating. One Japanese destroyer simply disappeared in a cloud of smoke and steam as dozens of .50 caliber bullets ripped through its hull. Another ship caught fire as tracer rounds ignited fuel and ammunition. But the Japanese were fighting back hard. Their gunners had never faced this kind of attack before, but they adapted quickly. Ships began making sharp turns to throw off the American aim. Some destroyers moved between the transports and the attacking bombers, using their own hulls as shields. Lawson lined up his B-25 on a Japanese transport ship. The vessel was huge, loaded with troops and supplies for the fighting in New Guinea. If he could sink it, hundreds of enemy soldiers would never reach the battlefield. He dropped to 30 feet above the waves and pressed forward through the curtain of anti-aircraft fire. At 200 yards, all 8 guns opened fire. The transport's superstructure disintegrated under the hail of bullets. Windows shattered, equipment exploded, and men fell to the deck. But the ship was still afloat. Lawson held down the trigger for another 5 seconds, walking his fire from bow to stern. Finally, he released his bombs and pulled up hard to avoid the ship's masts. Behind him, the skip bombs did their deadly work. One bomb bounced perfectly off the water and smashed through the transport's hull just above the waterline. Water poured into the ship through the massive hull. Within minutes, the vessel was listing heavily to one side. All across the convoy, similar scenes played out. The 8-gun B-25s were proving themselves as ship killers beyond anything their designers had imagined. Japanese vessels that had survived months of conventional bombing attacks were being torn apart in minutes by the concentrated machine gun fire. One by one, the enemy ships began to disappear beneath the waves. The Japanese convoy that had seemed so powerful that morning was dissolving into scattered debris and lifeboats. Survivors clung to wreckage as fuel oil spread across the water in dark slicks. But the Americans were paying a price too. Several B-25s had been shot down by the intense Japanese defensive fire. Other planes limped back to Australia with dead crew members and damaged engines. The ship killer tactic was deadly effective, but it was also dangerous for the attackers. As the surviving American bombers headed home, they left behind a scene of destruction that would be remembered for decades. The Bismarck Sea was littered with the remains of what had once been a proud Japanese convoy. The new American tactic had passed its first major test with devastating results. Word of the victory spread quickly through Allied forces in the Pacific. The ship killers had proven that Japanese naval power could be challenged and defeated. More importantly, they had shown that American innovation and determination could overcome any advantage the enemy thought they possessed. But this was just the beginning. The success in the Bismarck Sea would lead to even more deadly modifications and tactics. The age of the ship killer was now fully underway. Lieutenant Jack Morrison gripped the controls of his B-25 Tondaleo as he spotted the Japanese destroyer cutting through the blue waters near WWII. It was April 1943, just weeks after the victory at Bismarck Sea, and the ship killers were hunting again. This time, Morrison was flying alone, separated from his squadron by bad weather and poor visibility. One American bomber against one Japanese warship. It would be a fair fight. The destroyer below was the Yukikaze, one of Japan's most famous warships. Her crew had fought in major battles across the Pacific and had never been seriously damaged by American attacks. The ship's captain, Commander Terauchi, watched the lone B-25 with more curiosity than fear. One bomber could not seriously threaten his well-armed destroyer. His crew had beaten off dozens of high-altitude bombing attacks. This will be no different. But as the B-25 dropped to wave height and came straight at his ship, Terauchi realized something was very wrong. This was not like the other American attacks. The bomber was not climbing to drop bombs from above. Instead, it was screaming toward his ship just 50 feet above the water, its nose bristling with what looked like 8 machine gun barrels. Morrison had been flying ship-killer missions for 2 months now. He knew exactly what his modified B-25 could do to enemy vessels. The 850 caliber guns in his nose were perfectly synchronized, all aimed at the same point 300 yards ahead of him. When he pressed the firing button, those 8 guns would send 5,100 bullets per minute towards whatever stood in front of them. No ship armor could stop that kind of concentrated fire. The Yukikaze opened fire first. Orange flashes erupted from the destroyer's guns as shells screamed past Morrison's cockpit. One explosion was so close that the blast wave rocked his bomber like a toy in a hurricane. Shrapnel rattled against the fuselage, and the smell of cordite filled the cockpit. But Morrison kept coming, his 8 guns aimed directly at the enemy bridge. At 400 yards, Morrison could see individual Japanese sailors running across the destroyer's deck. Some were trying to swing additional guns toward his approaching bomber. Others were diving for cover behind whatever protection they could find. All of them looked terrified. They had never faced anything like this before. At 300 yards, Morrison pressed the firing button. The noise inside the cockpit was beyond description. All 8 machine guns erupted at once, creating a sound like the world's largest jackhammer. The entire bomber shuddered from the recoil as thousands of .50 caliber bullets poured from the guns. Empty shell cases filled the nose compartment in seconds, bouncing off the walls like metallic rain. The effect on the Japanese destroyer was immediate and catastrophic. The concentrated fire from 8 heavy machine guns was like being hit by a metal hurricane. The ship's bridge simply disintegrated as hundreds of bullets ripped through steel plates and equipment. Windows exploded, radio gear sparked and died, and the ship's officers fell where they stood. Morrison held down the trigger for a full 10 seconds, walking his fire from the destroyer's bow to its stern. The 8 guns chewed through everything in their path. Anti-aircraft guns were blown apart, their crews killed before they could return fire. Fuel lines ruptured, sending aviation gas streaming across the deck. Ammunition lockers exploded in chains of secondary blasts that lit up the ship like fireworks. But Morrison was not finished. As he passed over the destroyer at 30 feet, he released his skip bombs. The weapons bounced once off the water and slammed into the ship's hull just below the waterline. The explosions opened massive holes in the destroyer's side, and seawater began pouring into the engine rooms. Commander Terauchi tried to give orders to his crew, but his voice communications were destroyed. The ship's steering was damaged, its engines were flooding, and fires were spreading across 3 decks. In less than 60 seconds, one American bomber had turned his proud warship into a sinking wreck. Morrison banked his B-25 around for another pass. Through his cockpit window, he could see the destroyer already listing to starboard. Smoke poured from multiple fires, and lifeboats were being lowered as the crew abandoned ship. The Yukikaze, veteran of a dozen Pacific battles, would be on the bottom within the hour. As Morrison flew back toward his Australian base, he thought about how much had changed since the war began. 18 months ago, American bombers had been almost helpless against Japanese ships. High-altitude bombing was so inaccurate that hitting an enemy vessel was mostly a matter of luck. Japanese naval commanders had operated with confidence, knowing that American air power posed little real threat to their convoys. Now everything was different. The 8-gun B-25s had changed the rules of naval warfare completely. Ships that had seemed invulnerable were now prey for lone bombers flying at wave height. Japanese captains who had once ignored American air attacks now turned and ran when they spotted the distinctive silhouette of a ship killer approaching. The transformation was not just in tactics and equipment. It was in the minds of the men who flew these deadly missions. Morrison remembered his first combat flight when he had been nervous about attacking a heavily armed enemy ship. Now he felt nothing but deadly confidence. His B-25 was no longer just a bomber. It was a ship killer designed for one purpose: turning Japanese warships into scrap metal. Back at the Brisbane airfield, mechanics were already working on the next improvement to the ship killer design. They had discovered that the 850 caliber guns could be supplemented with additional weapons. Some B-25s now carried rockets mounted under their wings. Others had been fitted with small cannons that could punch holes in ship armor. Each new modification made the bombers more deadly. Pappy Gunn walked among the parked B-25s, checking on the modifications his teams had installed. Every plane was different now, customized for specific types of targets. Some were optimized for attacking large transports. Others were designed to kill destroyers and cruisers. A few experimental models carried new weapons that were still being tested. The Japanese were trying to adapt to the new American tactics. Their ships now traveled with more fighter escorts and heavier anti-aircraft armament. Some convoys had been rerouted to avoid areas where the ship killers operated. But these defensive measures came too late. American air power in the Pacific had been transformed from a minor annoyance into a deadly threat that Japanese naval commanders could no longer ignore. Intelligence reports confirmed what the air crews already knew from their combat missions. Japanese morale was cracking under the pressure of repeated ship-killer attacks. Radio intercepts revealed panic in enemy communications when American bombers were spotted approaching. Some Japanese captains were refusing to sail without massive escort formations that tied up warships needed elsewhere. The psychological impact was as important as the physical destruction. For 2 years, Japan had dominated the Pacific through naval power. Their ships had carried the war to American territory and had seemed almost invincible. Now those same ships were being hunted and destroyed by modified bombers that had not even existed when the war began. Morrison landed his B-25 Tondileo as the sun set over Australia. Ground crews rushed to inspect the bomber for damage and to count the empty shell cases that would tell them how much ammunition had been fired. Morrison climbed down from his cockpit and walked slowly toward the operations tent, still feeling the vibration of 8 machine guns firing in unison. The war was far from over, but something fundamental had changed. American ingenuity had found a way to neutralize Japan's naval advantage. The ship killers were no longer experimental weapons. They were proven combat systems that had transformed the balance of power in the Pacific. Every Japanese warship was now vulnerable to attack by bombers that could appear without warning and destroy targets that had once seemed untouchable. The age of Japanese naval supremacy was ending, one sunken ship at a time. The war was over. Lieutenant Jack Morrison stood on the deck of a transport ship as it pulled into San Francisco Bay in September 1945. Behind him, other veterans of the Pacific Campaign watched the Golden Gate Bridge grow larger as they approached home. Morrison carried a duffel bag filled with letters, photographs, and a small piece of metal that he had kept from his B-25 Tondileo. It was a fragment from one of the 8 machine guns that had made him famous as a ship killer. The newspapers were full of stories about atomic bombs and surrender ceremonies. But Morrison knew the real story of victory in the Pacific was more complicated. Yes, the final blow had come from new superweapons dropped by B-29s. But the foundation of victory had been built over 3 years of grinding warfare, much of it fought by modified B-25 bombers that had turned Japanese shipping into scrap metal. Back in Dayton, Ohio, Morrison's hometown looked exactly the same as it had when he left in 1942. The same houses lined the same streets. The same factory smokestacks rose against the skyline. But Morrison himself was different. He had learned things about war and technology and human courage that could not be unlearned. He had seen American ingenuity solve problems that seemed impossible and had watched ordinary mechanics create weapons that changed the course of history. Back at the Brisbane airfield, mechanics were already working on the next improvement to the ship killer design. They had discovered that the 850 caliber guns could be supplemented with additional weapons. Some B-25s now carried rockets mounted under their wings. Others had been fitted with small cannons that could punch holes in ship armor. Each new modification made the bombers more deadly. Pappy Gunn walked among the parked B-25s, checking on the modifications his teams had installed. Every plane was different now, customized for specific types of targets. Some were optimized for attacking large transports. Others were designed to kill destroyers and cruisers. A few experimental models carried new weapons that were still being tested. Pappy Gunn walked among the parked B-25s, checking on the modifications his teams had installed. Every plane was different now, customized for specific targets. Some were optimized for attacking large transports. Others were designed to kill destroyers and cruisers. A few experimental models carried new weapons that were still being tested. The Japanese were trying to adapt to the new American tactics. Their ships now traveled with more fighter escorts and heavier anti-aircraft armament. Some convoys had been rerouted to avoid areas where the ship killers operated. But these defensive measures came too late. American air power in the Pacific had been transformed from a minor annoyance into a deadly threat that Japanese naval commanders could no longer ignore. Intelligence reports confirmed what the air crews already knew from their combat missions. Japanese morale was cracking under the pressure of repeated ship-killer attacks. Radio intercepts revealed panic in enemy communications when America... At the local airfield where Morrison had learned to fly before the war, a small crowd gathered to hear him speak about his experiences. Children pressed close to listen as he described the ship-killer missions over the Pacific. Their eyes grew wide when he told them about flying 50 feet above the ocean waves while enemy shells exploded all around his bomber. "How many ships did you sink?" asked a young boy whose father had served in the Navy. Morrison thought carefully before answering. His personal record showed 12 confirmed kills, but numbers could not capture what the ship killers had really accomplished. "It wasn't about how many ships we sank," he said finally. "It was about changing the way wars are fought. We proved that American workers and mechanics could build weapons that nobody else had ever imagined." Across the Pacific, similar homecoming scenes were playing out in dozens of American towns. Captain Bill Benn returned to his family farm in Iowa, bringing with him detailed knowledge of low-level attack tactics that would influence military doctrine for decades. Other ship killer veterans became test pilots, airline captains, and aviation engineers. They carried their combat experience into peacetime jobs that would help America maintain its technological edge. But the most important homecoming belonged to Major Paul "Pappy" Gunn. The mechanic who had started the ship killer revolution returned to his family in the Philippines, where he had lived before the war. His wife and children had survived 3 years of Japanese occupation, and they greeted him as a hero who had helped drive the invaders from their homeland. Gunn brought with him complete plans and specifications for all the B-25 modifications he had developed during the war. These documents would become the foundation for post-war research into ground attack aircraft. Military engineers studied every detail of the 8-gun nose configuration, learning lessons that would influence the design of jets and helicopters for years to come. The contrast between wartime innovation and peacetime application was striking. Weapons that had been created in desperation were now being analyzed by teams of scientists and engineers. The same 8 machine guns that had destroyed Japanese destroyers became the inspiration for new defensive systems designed to protect American ships from similar attacks. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, several B-25s with 8-gun noses were preserved for historical study. Military analysts wanted to understand exactly how guns modifications had been so effective. They measured firing angles, studied ammunition consumption rates, and calculated the precise impact of concentrated machine gun fire on different types of ship armor. The results confirmed what the combat veterans already knew. The 8-gun configuration had created a weapon system unlike anything that had existed before the war. The concentrated firepower was equivalent to 8 fighters attacking the same target at the same time, but delivered from a single platform that could also carry bombs and operate independently over long distances. More importantly, the ship killer program had demonstrated the importance of field modifications and creative problem solving. Traditional military procurement systems would have taken years to develop and test new weapons. Gunn and his teams had created effective combat systems in weeks using available parts and improvised manufacturing techniques. This lesson influenced American military thinking throughout the Cold War. Rapid innovation became a key part of American defense strategy. When new threats appeared, American engineers and mechanics were expected to find creative solutions quickly, just as the ship killer teams had done in the Pacific. The Japanese perspective on the ship killers was very different. Former enemy naval officers who survived the war spoke with respect about the American bombers that had devastated their fleets. Captain Teriyuchi, who had commanded the destroyer Yukikaze before it was sunk by Morrison's B-25, was interviewed by American historians in 1950. "We knew American pilots were brave," Teriyuchi said through a translator, "but we did not understand American creativity. Your mechanics turned ordinary bombers into weapons we had never seen before. When we finally understood what you were doing, it was too late. Our ships were already on the bottom of the ocean." The numbers told the story of the ship killer's impact. Between March 1943 and August 1945, modified B-25s sank or damaged more than 300 Japanese vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, and large transport ships. Traditional high-altitude bombing had achieved hit rates of less than 2%. The ship killers achieved hit rates of more than 60%, making them the most effective anti-shipping weapon of the entire war. But statistics could not capture the psychological impact of the ship killer campaign. Japanese naval operations had been fundamentally disrupted by the threat of low-level bombing attacks. Convoys that had once moved freely across the Pacific now required massive escorts that tied up warships needed for other operations. The mere presence of ship killers in an area was enough to force changes in enemy tactics and strategy. By 1947, the last of the wartime B-25s were being retired from active service. Jet aircraft were taking over the mission of ground attack, using lessons learned from the ship killer program. The age of propeller-driven bombers was ending, but the innovations pioneered by Pappy Gunn and his teams lived on in new aircraft designs. Morrison kept the piece of metal from his B-25's machine gun on his desk for the rest of his life. Visitors would ask about it, and he would tell them the story of how American mechanics had changed the course of a war by refusing to accept that things had to be done the way they had always been done before. "That little piece of steel represents something important," Morrison would say. "It shows what Americans can do when we stop thinking about why something won't work and start thinking about how to make it work. We didn't have the biggest navy or the most advanced technology when the war started, but we had mechanics like Pappy Gunn who could look at a problem and see a solution that nobody else had thought of." The ship killer program had proven that innovation was more powerful than tradition, that creativity could overcome superior numbers, and that American ingenuity was a weapon as deadly as any bomb or bullet. These lessons would serve the nation well in the decades to come, as new challenges required new solutions that could only be found by people willing to think differently about old problems. The museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base opened a special exhibit about the ship killers in 1950. Thousands of visitors came to see the preserved B-25 with its 8-gun nose, many of them veterans who had fought in different theaters of the war. They marveled at the simplicity of the design and the effectiveness of the solution. School children on field trips would climb into the cockpit simulators, trying to imagine what it felt like to fly at wave height while enemy gunners tried to shoot them down. Dr. Theodore von Karman, the famous aeronautical engineer, studied the ship killer modifications as part of a larger research project on wartime innovation. His team interviewed dozens of mechanics, pilots, and engineers who had worked on the project. What they discovered surprised them. The most effective military innovation of the Pacific War had not come from a major defense contractor or a government laboratory. It had emerged from the creative problem-solving of field mechanics working with hand tools and spare parts. This lesson influenced American military thinking throughout the Cold War. Rapid innovation became a key part of American defense strategy. When new threats appeared, American engineers and mechanics were expected to find creative solutions quickly, just as the ship killer teams had done in the Pacific. The Japanese perspective on the ship killers was very different. Former enemy naval officers who survived the war spoke with respect about the American bombers that had devastated their fleets. Captain Terayuchi, who had commanded the destroyer Yukikaze before it was sunk by Morrison's B-25, was interviewed by American historians in 1950. "We knew American pilots were brave," Terayuchi said through a translator, "but we did not understand American creativity. Your mechanics turned ordinary bombers into weapons we had never seen before. When we finally understood what you were doing, it was too late. Our ships were already on the bottom of the ocean." The numbers told the story of the ship killer's impact.
Between March 1943 and August 1945, modified B-25s sank or damaged more than 300 Japanese vessels, including destroyers, cruisers, and large transport ships. Traditional high-altitude bombing had achieved hit rates of less than 2%. The ship killers achieved hit rates of more than.
The Ship Killer program represents American engineering at its finest, von Karman wrote in his final report. Complex problems were solved with elegant simplicity. Expensive solutions were rejected in favor of practical ones. Most importantly, the people closest to the problem were given the freedom to experiment and improve. This philosophy became central to American military development during the early years of the Cold War. When the Soviet Union developed new weapons or tactics, American response teams included not just scientists and generals, but also experienced mechanics and field technicians who understood how to make things work under combat conditions. Morrison's son grew up hearing stories about his father's war experiences, but it was not until he became an aerospace engineer himself that he fully understood the significance of what the ship killer teams had accomplished. Working on early missile programs in the 1960s, he encountered the same kinds of technical challenges that had faced his father's generation. The solutions often came from the same source: experienced technicians who were willing to try new approaches when conventional methods failed. Morrison's son taught me that the best engineers are not the ones who can design the most complex systems, Morrison's son would later write in his memoirs. They are the ones who can find the simplest way to solve a difficult problem. That's what the ship killers were all about. Simple solutions that worked when nothing else would. The influence of ship killer tactics extended far beyond military aviation. Commercial airlines adopted low-level navigation techniques that had been pioneered by B-25 pilots flying just above the ocean waves. Emergency rescue services used modified versions of the skip bombing technique to deliver supplies to disaster areas. Even space program engineers studied the precision timing and coordination required for successful ship killer attacks when they were designing lunar landing procedures. Pappy Gunn lived to see jets replace propeller aircraft, missiles replace bombs, and computers replace human gunners. But he never lost his faith in the power of hands-on problem solving. Until his death in 1957, he continued to work as a consultant for aircraft manufacturers, teaching young engineers the lessons he had learned during the darkest days of the Pacific War. Technology changes, but problems remain the same, Gunn would tell his students. The enemy will always try to protect himself in ways that make your job harder. Your job is to think of something he has not thought of yet. That requires creativity, not just engineering knowledge. The final B-25 ship killer mission was flown on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan announced its surrender. Lieutenant Colonel James Thompson led a formation of 12 8-gun bombers against a Japanese convoy trying to reach the home islands with supplies for continued resistance. The convoy was destroyed completely, with no American losses. It was a fitting end to a campaign that had fundamentally changed naval warfare. Thompson returned to civilian life as a commercial airline pilot, but he kept detailed records of every ship killer mission he had flown. These documents became invaluable to military historians trying to understand how the campaign had been so successful. The records showed not just what had worked, but what had not worked and why. "We made plenty of mistakes in the beginning," Thompson wrote in his flight diary. "The first few missions were disasters. Planes were shot down, targets were missed, and tactics had to be completely rewritten. But we kept learning and improving. That's what made the difference in the end." The learning process had been brutal but effective. Early ship killer missions had casualty rates of nearly 30%. By 1944, casualty rates had dropped to less than 5%, even though the targets were becoming more heavily defended. American crews had learned to use weather, timing, and coordination to maximize their chances of success while minimizing their exposure to enemy fire. These tactical innovations influenced military training programs for decades. The idea that combat effectiveness could be improved through systematic analysis of mission results became standard practice in all branches of the armed forces. What had started as an informal process of trial and error in Australian workshops became a formal methodology taught at military academies around the world. Foreign military observers who studied the Ship Killer program came away impressed not just by American technology, but by American willingness to experiment and adapt. European air forces had been dominated by rigid doctrine and traditional tactics. The Americans had thrown out the rulebook and created something entirely new when the old methods proved inadequate. This flexibility became a defining characteristic of American military culture during the Cold War. When faced with new challenges in Korea, Vietnam, and other conflicts, American forces consistently demonstrated an ability to adapt their tactics and equipment to meet changing conditions. The ship killer spirit of innovation lived on in new generations of warriors who understood that victory often required thinking differently about familiar problems. Morrison died in 1987, having lived to see the development of precision-guided munitions that could destroy targets with single shots. But he always maintained that technology alone was not the key to military success. The human element remained crucial. Someone still had to identify the problem, design the solution, and execute the mission under dangerous conditions. The 8 guns were just tools, Morrison said in his final interview with a military historian. The real weapon was the American spirit that refused to accept defeat. When conventional tactics failed, we found new ones. When standard equipment was inadequate, we modified it. When the enemy adapted to our methods, we adapted faster. That's how wars are really won. The ship killer legacy extended into the 21st century through veterans organizations, military museums, and historical preservation societies. Restored B-25s with 8-gun noses appeared at air shows across the country, giving new generations a chance to see and hear the weapons that had helped turn the tide in the Pacific. The sound of 8.50 caliber machine guns firing in unison remained as impressive in peacetime demonstrations as it had been in wartime combat. Children who watched these demonstrations often asked the same questions that Morrison had heard decades earlier. How fast did the planes fly? How many bullets could the guns fire? How many enemy ships had been sunk? But the most important questions were different. How did ordinary people create such extraordinary weapons? What made them think that their ideas would work when everyone else said they were impossible? The answers to those questions contained lessons that transcended military history. They spoke to fundamental aspects of American character: the willingness to challenge authority, the confidence to experiment with new ideas, and the determination to keep trying when initial attempts failed. These qualities had enabled a small group of mechanics and pilots to change the course of the largest war in human history. In the end, the 8 machine guns mounted in the nose of a B-25 bomber had done more than sink Japanese ships. They had demonstrated the power of American creativity to change the world, one innovative solution at a time. The ship killer spirit lived on in every engineer who refused to accept that a problem could not be solved, every mechanic who saw potential improvements in existing designs, and every pilot who was willing to try a dangerous new tactic because it might save lives and win battles. The legacy was not just about weapons or warfare. It was about the American belief that any problem could be solved if the right people were given the freedom to think creatively and the resources to test their ideas.
That belief had turned ordinary bombers into ship killers, and it would continue to drive American innovation long after the last veteran of the Pacific Campaign had passed into history. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.